Well,
I like the other
I
better.
think we got close at least. All right. Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Herman Taylor, who comes from us from the Morehouse School of Medicine, where he is directing the Cardiovascular Research Institute. Dr. Taylor received his MD from Harvard and also his MPH from Harvard, and did residencies and fellowships at UNC and University of Alabama at Birmingham, that's your hometown as well.
That's right.
Yes. So, where he did his cardiology fellowship. From 1999 onward, he has been at University of Mississippi Medical Center, as well as Jackson State and Tougaloo, where he was directing the Jackson Heart Study, which is a landmark study following a cohort of African Americans and looking at cardiovascular disease and risk factors over a 15-year period. That project's still ongoing. Brown's one of the vanguard sites for data analysis. I know that there's students here who have been working with Jackson Heart Study, so it's really exciting to have Dr. Taylor here to tell us more about his work. And about 8 months ago, he moved to Morehouse College to direct the Cardiovascular Research Institute. Looking forward to having him with us today. So welcome, Dr. Taylor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you for this kind invitation. I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to some of you afterwards. I've enjoyed my meetings over the last 24 hours as well. I think you guys have something really special going on here, and I wish you all well in your various areas of endeavor. What I want to talk to you somewhat briefly about today is the launch of the Jackson Heart Study, the lessons that I think can be learned even at what is for longitudinal cohort studies a fairly early to teenage year level of maturity for such a study. I hope to leave you with the impression that it was and is a labor of love, but it has not been easy. Going forward, it will continue to be challenging in some respects, but I think all along the way there will be lessons to be learned, not only about a group of African Americans in Jackson, Mississippi, but lessons that may have national and ultimately global implications. So let's get started. I think for those of you who may be familiar with that part of the country, you know that a few miles northwest of Jackson is a part of the state called the Delta, and if you were traveling through with an untrained eye, you might think that this was a desolate stretch of land. In fact, teeming just below the surface are all the ingredients to produce something that looks like this in just a few weeks. And a little bit further down the road, wheat, soybean, cotton, things that feed and clothe millions. Again, not just in the state of Mississippi, but around the country and beyond. Mississippi is a surprising state for other reasons as well. Everyone is quite familiar with the unfortunate history of racial strife that is a fact, is a part of Mississippi history, as it is our country. But who would think that out of that type of history, a group of authors and writers who really articulated, described, chronicled, and brought insight and interpretation to that journey and other aspects of American life. You probably recognize, I know all of you are very literate, you probably recognize everybody here, Eudora Welty, Richard Wright, Mary Alexander Walker, William Faulkner, Walter Percy, and there are others of even more recent vintage who continue that. A state where that difficult history has also produced leaders who have pricked the consciousness of the nation and pushed us towards consideration of reconciliation, of social justice. All this to say that, again, out of Mississippi, some surprising things. And who would think that in the state where we really have the epicenter of an epidemic of cardiovascular disease and other diseases, that that state, that environment would give rise to people like William Guyton, who wrote the one of the most basic textbooks in medical training. Medical Physiology is the most widely used medical textbook in the world. A gentleman who did the first lung transplant in the world and did an early heart transplant. And people like Dr. William Shirley, who were early champions for the resolution of health disparities through the community health center movement and other things, and who we just lost just a few months ago to an untimely death, because even at 80 plus, he was active and working, and he came up with ideas like the Jackson Medical Mall, where the Jackson Heart Study is housed. So in this crucible, in this state, challenged by so much, the Jackson Heart Study has arisen as well. And I think it's appropriate, one, because it is the epicenter of the epidemic, and two, that while the nation as a whole over the last 50 years or so has undergone what you have to consider a public health success, that is the dramatic decline in deaths from cardiovascular disease, while the nation as a whole has had that experience, that has not borne true, as I think most of you know, for every segment of our society. If you use one indicator, the incidence of first heart attacks, you see that while data from 4 cities in the United States, taken from the ERIC study, which I think many of you may be familiar with, we can talk about later if you like, but surveillance data suggests that while white men and white women are following that national trend in these 4 cities, black men and black women seem to be bucking that national trend in terms of first heart attacks. Now, that's not fatality, but that is the start of a long potential cascade of events that could lead to early mortality, congestive heart failure, repeat heart attacks, and generally a much more morbid course for the remainder of one's life. But in mortality, we see a widening and seemingly intractable gap for death from cardiovascular disease. This instance is graphically describing cardiovascular mortality for men, comparing black men against all men in the United States, black men in Mississippi. So this may be interpreted as a worst case scenario. That is, black men in Mississippi have, if not the highest, among the highest rates of cardiovascular mortality in the nation. But you can see here dramatically that this only goes out to 2002. And these trends continue a little bit further south, but the gap is persistent. And the thing that, for me, that's most dramatic about this is that you look at the rate in 2004 and look at the rate in 1976, and they're just about the same. Now, again, as I said, the trend has come down some in the years since 2005, 2006, but the gap remains, and it's dramatic, and it's an indictment in ways of our ability to prevent disease and take care of it when it does occur. So the Jackson Heart Study then was born of a concern to address these problems. And I think, again, if you're not familiar with it, it has some of the basic characteristics of a classic longitudinal epidemiological study. It's a large community-based study, observational in nature, and it represents by numbers 6.6% of all age-eligible African Americans in a tri-county area surrounding Jackson, composing the metropolitan statistical area of Jackson, Mississippi. There are examinations and interviews. In fact, examinations, because of funding issues, the examinations have been suspended for now, although ancillary studies can bring people back for different purposes. But just like Framingham and some other studies, we've been hit by budget cuts that have limited that aspect of the Jackson Heart Study. Interviews are part of the examination, part of the visits, and between those actual come-to-clinic visits and interviews, there are annual interviews by phone, and there's ongoing surveillance of hospitalizations. We have 8 hospitals in the area. We have a close relationship with all 8. So anytime our participants go in and out of the hospital, we have records of that, and they, of course, have consented to that type of monitoring and surveillance. But there were more reasons and more aspects of the Jackson Heart Study than the very important look at the epidemiology of cardiovascular disease in this vulnerable population. And another chief aim of the Jackson Heart Study, which is a bit of a misnomer because there are several programs that constitute the Jackson Heart Study. One of the chief aims was to, in our way, begin to address the chronic issue of underrepresentation of African Americans and other populations, other underrepresented populations, in the very fields that could have something to do with changing health status among African Americans. This graphic just points to African Americans who are being successful in academics here, and success being measured by the probability of receiving an investigator-initiated grant from the National Institutes of Health, a very important a rite of passage, if nothing else, that helps guarantee a successful academic career with some longevity, and that people aren't lost to other career paths. But in addition to the more purely academic statistics, these are important to keep in mind as well. Minorities make up 28% of the population, but only 3% of the medical school faculty, just focusing on physicians first. Only 7% of all physicians are from minority groups. 16% of public health school faculty, only 16%, and 17% of all city and county health officers. Fully 98% of senior leaders in healthcare management are white. So this gives a certain lack of diversity, and I think lack of breadth and depth of research if this is allowed to be the standard on into the future. And I like this quote, and it's been said many other ways, but from the American Journal of Public Health. While epidemiology is an objective scientific discipline, it is also partisan, reflecting underlying values and assumptions of the people engaged in the research. You know, people, I mean, scientists are people first. They come with a certain worldview, a certain orientation, a certain set of questions that may expand as they grow and go through the educational training and early career process, but they carry those values and assumptions with them by and large, and that will influence what questions they ask, what data they seek, and how they interpret the data that comes back. So this coalition of schools in Jackson came together and are working towards the Jackson Heart Study, working on the Jackson Heart Study, and our investment in the future is reflected in this picture. And these are graduates of our Jackson Heart Study Scholar program, based primarily at Tougaloo. Tougaloo was mentioned in the introduction. And how many Tougaloo people do we have here? Only one today? Oh, hi. Hey, how are you? Okay. You just came in. I said, okay, good to see you. Good to see you. Okay. And here are two. Let's see. I didn't have your picture. I'm sorry. And yours either, Melvin. Sorry about that. But Jamil Taylor, no relation, and Montoya Taylor, also no relation. Some have said that, some have suggested that. But yeah, two of our shining stars. Montoya, who's often been accused of being my son, he's not. But Montoya is our first cardiologist out of the Jackson Heart Study program. So back to the study itself. Comprehensive assessment of a lot of clinical variables, and you can see them here. I won't read them all, but this is just to give you a sense, again, that the Jackson Heart Study data is rich. There's a Vanguard Center here that has access to these data. This was taken, this represents baseline data acquisition, the baseline protocol. And then 3 to 4 years later, a second exam, which was abbreviated out of concern that people might not come back. The first examination was 5.5 hours long on average. That's right. Whoa is the appropriate response. That's a whole day, a whole work day. Most of your waking hours spent being poked, prodded, questioned. And there was a real concern that maybe we won't have great retention after such an experience. But the clinic staff that was on the front line here was absolutely incredible. And most people left incredibly satisfied and wanting to come back. Exam 3, 3 years after that, approximately, was again the full-bore protocol with the addition of some specialized imaging that is represented here and animated so you would be impressed that there are some high-tech data acquisition parts of the protocol that give us an incredibly, again, rich and deeply phenotyped group of African Americans. And the beauty of that, of course, is that you take all of that physiologic data and you enrich it tremendously by doing the battery of psychosocial and sociocultural questionnaires and interviews, et cetera, that really enrich the database tremendously and make it, I think, uniquely worthwhile. So let's talk about some of the early insights and early lessons. And the first one I put up here is the speed of trust. And I will say that given the history and given some of the things I've already mentioned in the opening, this had to be taken into consideration. Here we are, an all-black, we're proposing to the community an all-black study in the South, sponsored by the federal government. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Okay, so the challenge then of past egregious violations of trust were not at the front of everyone's mind initially, but as things turned out, it became an interesting time to begin recruitment. First, this is a pre-recruitment survey. And you can see, I think you can see the responses. They didn't bode well for, rapid accrual of the 5,000 or so people that we were aiming for. We wanted to get more than the Framingham study's first attempt, which was 5,201, 5,209. And just so there's no suspense, we got 5,301. So we win. No. But you see that people said, in general, medical research treats people fairly well. A bare majority, a large minority said they weren't so sure. People put themselves at risk. A third of the respondents suggested that that was probably true. Medical research is too hard for people like me to understand. It's a black box, something I really don't get and possibly best avoided. And then finally, a minority, but not just a fringe, this is 14%, suggested that medical research was a way for the government to keep black people down. Now that might sound really weird to some, and I see some people frowning up a little bit, but this was at a time when you could really get a very, a real in-depth conversation out of highly educated, intelligent African Americans about whether or not the HIV virus was something concocted in a lab with a particular affinity for blacks. There's been concern. There have been, in fact, major breaches in the past. And you add to that the rumors about medical centers and what they did behind those walls and those towers. You talk to folks who live around UAB or around Johns Hopkins who may or may not know the Henrietta Lacks story, which is a whole other thing we could talk about. But they carry the suspicion that this is not a system that necessarily is there ultimately for their benefit. So then this becomes, in that context, not something so far-fetched. Again, as we started to recruit, the whole Tuskegee episode came back into popular discussion. Why? Because a long overdue apology was issued by President Clinton in 1997-98 followed by this HBO movie, Miss Evers' Boys, which dramatized the Tuskegee experiment. And that also, I think, influenced at least a little bit some of the survey results we got. This is an interesting handbill. Can you all see this? You know, colored people, do you have bad blood? Free blood test, free treatment. And seemed like a good deal if you were concerned about your blood, but we all, I think, know how that turned out. So, but for the trust of some individuals who were actually in the medical profession, people in the community who had participated in other studies and therefore had fairly high levels of trust. And an approach that began with expressing how much we cared about the community, sharing of information, listening back to what the community had to tell us. But for that process and those people, we had a very tough job ahead, but it's folks like this who really helped us get over the hump. Their involvement was not only just for PR, but people were involved in helping us develop the protocol, select things for the protocol, what was ill-advised to, for instance, ask in a first visit when you're just trying to get to know people and so on. Selection of people who actually went out and did the recruitment. They were on the selection committee. They sat on the steering committee of the Jackson Heart Study, not just in an advisory capacity, but voting members who had the right to stop meetings and stop what we would call progress until things were clear to them as lay people and people who had an investment in how this whole thing would turn out. Okay, so this is our first group of recruiters. And as I said, we wound up getting 5,300 people, and over 85% came back after that grueling first examination and interview, which took 5.5 hours. And then about 80% of survivors returned for a third exam. So, turning to some of the early results, we're often compared to Framingham for many reasons, and one of our first analyses looked at a direct comparison with age-matched Framingham participants. And this shows something that will not surprise anyone who follows obesity literature at all, and that if you look at people with normal BMI, black and white, the blue represents Framingham. You'll see that there are 3 times as many people in the normal BMI category, and here in the stage 2 obesity category, 3 times as many blacks. So obesity is a real problem in the African American community. It's not all obesity. If you look at normal, compare normal BMI blacks and whites, you see this problem, that diabetes is 3 times as frequent, 3 times more frequent among African Americans than whites. Hypertension similarly increased. High LDL and high and low HDL, both negative factors for cardiovascular risk, all higher in blacks and whites. And only high triglycerides showed whites slightly more than blacks, and that one did not achieve statistical significance. But here's an interesting thing also that the data suggests. Again, a black-white Framingham U.S. comparison, a Framingham Jackson Heart Study comparison. In every stage of every category of BMI, we see that obesity is more prevalent among blacks and whites. But if you'll notice the slope of the rise from normal to stage 2, that in almost every case, the slope is significantly steeper among whites. An interesting finding, that is that, I mean, if you loosely interpreted that, it would suggest that somehow obesity is a bad thing, but it's somehow less toxic dose-wise in the black population than the white. I would, of course, urge great caution in that interpretation, because of, if you look at obesity on a population attributable risk basis, there's so much obesity, and the sequelae of that are so significant that we have to continue to press the public health message that obesity is not a good thing. and not suggest that blacks are somehow less prone to the negative consequences. If you look at hypertension, what this shows is actually a surprising result, that overall hypertension control was nearly 70%, which is much higher than most people would have thought. If you go on the basis of older literature, blacks, particularly African American men, often control rates were quoted down in the low 20s or even the teens. We found something quite different in Jackson, and we think in part that's because of the fact that the Jackson heart study is, unlike a lot of studies that are reported, not a study of just poor black people. It's a study of a fairly diverse group. There's about a third of the people in the study who have completed college and have higher degrees. There's a quarter that didn't complete high school, and the rest are spread between. So it is it distinguishes itself in being a little more diverse within the African American population than other studies have been in the past. Early work on the social determinants of health has been very interesting, and this assortment of papers doesn't really do it justice, but already studies that look at and indict discrimination as being a contributor to hypertension, diabetes, and socioeconomic position being related to phenomena like nocturnal dipping in the blood pressure have been published and are being looked at very carefully. To look at the dipping phenomenon, I think most people know, but I know it's not an all-clinician audience. At night, your blood pressure should dip. That's a good physiologic pattern for you to have. And in fact, if it doesn't do that, we find that people who don't dip significantly are more prone to organ damage such as kidney disease, left ventricular hypertrophy, enlargement of the heart, and other problems related to cardiovascular issues. And so it's a good thing to be down here. It's a bad thing to be up here. And this just shows what you probably would expect, that people who are better off in terms of financial position are more likely and show evidence of having deeper, healthful dips in their blood pressure at night, whereas people who are more poverty-stricken don't enjoy that same healthful physiologic pattern. Again, social determinants of health are assessed fairly thoroughly as you can in an epidemiological study through the Jackson Heart Study. So that's a rich area for investigation for those of you who are interested in those issues. And there's a lot of papers on genetics. I'm not a geneticist, but this is just scratching the surface. And usually the genetics work has been done in collaboration with other large cohorts, accumulating large numbers to do things like genome-wide association scans to look for single nucleotide polymorphisms that may be pointing to a genetic basis of disease. Are there geneticists in the audience? No. Okay. We'll move on. Okay. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about risk. And we spent a lot of time, I think appropriately so, talking about disparities. And the drumbeat begins to be that African Americans have worse than you fill in the blank, right? There's worse hypertension, early deaths, short lifespan, and other things that are generally negative. Okay. Now, and on an aggregate group basis, obviously that's true. Disparities are real, and we need to attend to that problem. It's a national shame, I think, to have that kind of difference that is based, that tracks along ethnic lines. It's a national shame. We're all one country. That shouldn't be. But that's one story. There's another part to the story that we should not lose sight of. African Americans are not a sick people. African Americans have had a unique experience, again, speaking in the aggregate. And in fact, there is much to suggest that African Americans, a lot of them are incredibly resilient. And we shouldn't lose that message while we focus on risk. We should look at how is it that African Americans who actually live to the age of 80, 82 have a longer lifespan than their white counterparts of the same age. How does that happen? How is it that as the groups age, if you set aside the phenomena of perhaps early mortality for the vulnerable people, okay, what makes it so that stroke risk and hypertension risk, that is mortality, all declines as we get closer to that 80s range? How is it that, given all of the adverse circumstances that we described and that Jackson Heart Studies documented and others have documented, how is it that 85% of African Americans don't have documented cardiovascular disease? 50% don't have hypertension. I mean, given the circumstances that I think all of us understand. So I think characterizing those aspects of life, the assets, those things that are positive and are buffering people against some of these environmental stresses and strains are important for us to investigate as a research community. So I think the whole concept of resilience is understudied and underappreciated, particularly among clinicians, that it's obscured by simple black-white comparisons in the aggregate. Blacks are not all the same thing. That heterogeneity is important to appreciate and learn from. And it has multiple dimensions for us to consider. So this is just to show you the rainbow is even broader than this, really, for African Americans. They are not all the same. What are the candidate aspects of life, psychosocial, sociocultural, physiologic, that might be responsible for the resilience of some people within the African American experience, if you will? And here's some of the things that are being actively looked at, and I would recommend them to you as vital areas for us to understand even better and see how it might explain the vigor of some African Americans. What assets, so if you look at neighborhood environment, for example, I mean, there are assets that certain neighborhoods have. It's not all deprivation when you're talking about African Americans. I use the example of my mother when we were talking yesterday, who is 88 years old. And Mom, despite some recent health challenges, she's gotten to be 88 years old, staying in her neighborhood, staying in the neighborhood I grew up in. And as I was saying yesterday, if you were to drive through my old neighborhood today, most of you would probably press on the accelerator because it is not, it's not an upper middle class neighborhood. We'll leave it at that. Mom, though, will not move. She is there for the duration. And why? What are the elements of that? If you look across the street, there's a guy who's a little bit older than me who brings her newspaper and mail every day. Next door, there was a younger woman who helped nurse her through a health challenge about 5 years ago. Her brothers and sisters are in and around town. She's the oldest of 7. She has 5 surviving siblings, and they all check on her and she on them. So she's embedded in that. And I think very likely that has added to her years. So my point is, again, heterogeneity, and back to neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have assets as well as something that you might see on casual view as deprivations. There may be some things that look poor. There may be a wall falling down here or an unkept lawn there. But within that, there are things that are positive. So we need to look for those and do what we can to undergird and help those things become more common. Moving to individual level factors, there's some attention now to Life's Simple 7. Are you guys familiar with that? That's the American Heart Association Cardiovascular Health Index. So the idea here, which is a bit of a paradigm shift for the American Heart Association, is to spend as much time talking about health factors as we do risk factors. And those health factors are things you predict. Actually, I have the slide. I'll show you in a second. Oops. These. Never smoked or quit more than a year ago, BMI, physical activity, and then healthy diet, which consists of extremely low salt, but other things such as high calcium and vegetable intake and so forth, total cholesterol level, blood pressure, etc. So focusing on those as health factors is sort of a new way to look at cardiovascular health and risk. And the absence of those obviously predisposes you to negative outcomes. What about psychosocial factors that may play into resilience? We sort of talked about social support, optimism, mastery, purpose in life. All these things have been pointed to as possible sources of resilience. Spirituality and mindfulness. And I added these 2 bullet points yesterday after my conversations with some of your faculty. These, I think, are very promising areas for us to look at in terms of not just psychological resilience, where I think the bulk of the attention for this concept has been placed, but also physiologic resilience. This is just thrown up to reemphasize the heterogeneity. So this is all about black women. This whole map is about black women and heart disease death. And you see the variety here. Now, this is just on, looking at place as an important factor. What is it about these places that makes the Delta of Mississippi a much more risky place to be with regards to heart disease than even Miami? What makes the Delta similar to Chicago? Those are very different places. What are the common denominators? These are things that we need more detail, need more granularity in order to understand better. One aspect might be fast food restaurant distribution. This is just some work from DeMark Hickson that looks at the relationship between that and obesity in the black community. This is showing that when it comes to those health factors I mentioned, that African Americans, again, in the Jackson Heart Study, typically don't have a high number of them. Very few had 6. None of them had 7 out of 7. Very few 6 out of 7. Not too many 5 out of 7. And as they got older, actually, most things were worse. But interestingly, physical activity was trending upward. We still have to work on figuring out exactly what that represents. Okay, so this is used without permission. Dr. Luke said he couldn't make it to the meeting today. But I read his paper last night, and I was really impressed about what he is finding and others in terms of cardiovascular health and disease and the concept of mindfulness. And using his mindfulness scale, and those Life Simple 7, the cardiovascular health index I just talked about, he found this positive relationship between the prevalence of good cardiovascular health and mindfulness. Okay. All of these scales were used in the Jackson Heart Study. You can glance at them to see that depression, stress, religiosity, and other things, violence, hostility, John Henryism, job strain. We can talk about some of those if you like. But this is just to show you again, to remind you how comprehensive that data that's in your Jackson Heart Study Vanguard Center is. And just as a teaser, one preliminary study, this was presented in abstract form. I'm still waiting on the paper, but it shows the relationship between people's regularity of experiencing the divine, having a spiritual experience, and their level of cortisol, that stress hormone, showing this graded relationship, with cortisol being pretty low among those who said they experienced the divine or some spiritual dimension nearly every day, all the way out here to the heathens who never, that's a joke, who say not at all, and had the highest cortisol levels. Okay. And we've talked about mostly psychosocial, social cultural elements that may play into resilience. We're also, we propose to look at the epigenetics of resilience. Is there a role of what genes are switched on and switched off as a result of whatever experiences or even transgenerational experiences that really are not part of the genome but part of the methylation patterns around the genome. And those things are changeable, while as the genome can be fairly obviously fixed. And what other molecules in what people refer to as the metabolome might indicate or be a fingerprint or signature, if you will, of people who are resilient and resist physiologic derangements that might lead to hypertension and other sequelae. That work into metabolic signatures is new and I think exciting, and something to stay tuned to. But again, all of this I think needs to turn not from merely an assessment of risk, but an assessment of resilience as well. So we're often, again, compared to the Framingham heart study, that is the Jackson heart study. And I think I like that, because the Framingham heart study has contributed so much to so many. And consider that for just a second. Framingham. That study originally included 5,209, fewer than the Jackson heart study, but 5,209 individuals who were either Italian Americans, Irish Americans, or Irish Italian Americans. That was almost all of them. They were situated in a tiny town outside of Boston, Massachusetts, which was mostly middle and upper class. That's a pretty restricted enrollment, right? Pretty restricted. But out of that, global principles have emerged. We have risk equations that, with tweaking here and there, have been used around the world. And I think it proves that a small, well-done study, or a study done in a fairly restricted environment, can offer insights that can have global applications. And it's with that that I would encourage you to take the Jackson Heart Study data extremely seriously, to take advantage of your access to it, and help us discover things that have yet to be discovered. Thank you very much. So, we have time for questions. Yes. Yes, you.
A great talk. I am from Brazil, and I'm a visiting professor here at Brown this semester.
Yes.
So I really enjoy listening to your hypothesis. And I have two comments. One is that in the policy level, what is being discussed and done in terms of really getting around this issue of disparities and the immense distance between cardiovascular disease among blacks and among whites in the United States. And second, the genetic hypothesis, even though I'm not a geneticist as well, I am an epidemiologist, a physician as a base, but I think in one hand it's a great technology, but in the other hand, if you think that that explanation would take away the real bottom line of the explanation of social position, of racial disparities. I mean, I think it's something that it has to be discussed and very careful of not taking away the real issues.
Two incredibly important points. I'll start with the second one. I think, I'll just say it, I think environment trumps genetics by far. Okay, I think genetics are important, or is important, for this concept where I think there's a lot of interest in personalizing medicine. Okay, so when you get back over into the biomedical realm, it will be important for us to understand those biological mechanisms that mediate disease and the heterogeneity of that. So I think it's an important thrust, and that needs to go forward, full bore. But can you think of a gene that would lead to higher rates of amputation, right, and diabetes, higher rates of hypertension from people who, on their continent of origin, there was no age-related hypertension, right? Where's the genetics in that? The rates of a variety of complex diseases, and in every category, African Americans have higher rates. What gene can explain that? What set of genes? I think that's impossible to ascribe to one or more genes alone. Now, that being said, I think we have to look for genetic explanations for some things. So it is disadvantageous, for instance, to be of Irish heritage and be living in Australia when it comes to skin cancer. So they have astronomical rates of skin cancer. And I sometimes refer to those as diseases of displacement, right? Some people put hypertension in the same category and says, well, after so many Africans died on the way here, the Middle Passage, the people who survived the dehydration, the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, the death on ships, and so on, that group concentrated in the gene pool the ability to retain salt, and that putting that set of genes in a salt-rich environment might lead to high levels of hypertension. So you have these kinds of discussions going on. So I think the genetic approach may yield some interesting insights. But, as long as we have such gross disparities in, socioeconomic position, things like discrimination and so forth, it's going to be tough to ascribe a genetic explanation to it. On the policy level, I think there's a lot of interest. There's certainly been a huge uptick in the study and the documentation of these disparities. I think that's been an important first step. What is lacking is a similarly robust investment in implementation of things that show promise to change some of these disparities. So I believe it's becoming a priority of the National Institutes of Health to do so, but I think we have a long way to go. Yes?
Hi, thank
Hello.
you. Wonderful talk. I want two things. One is I just wanted to say if folks are interested in the Vanguard Center and using the data, please come talk to me. I can work with you through figuring out the data and the publications and presentations committee submission. The second thing is, we had a great talk yesterday. I'm very interested in your thoughts on keeping a great retention rate for the cohort to have 80% at 10 years returning. And you and I had talked about how the lay summaries and providing information back to the community.
Right.
If you wanted to talk more about that and how that works.
Excellent point. How do you keep people coming back? And there are many elements. And it's, as you mentioned, communication has been key. And that communication has several dimensions. So one is the participation of lay people in our committees. Now, I will tell you that's not the fastest way to do science. That's not the quickest way to get publications out, right? When somebody stops you and says, okay, so what is a SNP, right? And you got to break that down. You got to take the time to do that. Or people have been empowered to raise questions. And if you push them aside or condescend, that gets communicated out to the community. So taking all questions seriously and dealing with people's concerns as they arise And then having people tell that story in the community has been very, very important. So they know we're for real, that it wasn't just, we weren't just doing things to get them to volunteer to come into the study, that this is their study. Those things are important. Communication in open forums. I remember talking to a group about the need for a genetics study or a particular approach to genetics. And after the talk, a little old lady, she was one of the first African American city council members in Jackson. She walks up to me as I'm leaving the stage, thinking I had done a great job, right? And she stops me and says, Dr. Taylor. So I walk over to her, and I had to bend a little because she was a little short. Yes, ma'am. She says, great talk. I have to tell you, I didn't really understand a lot of that. He says, but I trust you. If, however, how does she put it? If you let me down, then I will be on you like white on rice. Now, why do I tell that story? I think it reflects an empowered group of people who feel like they can talk to us on a fairly equal level. They don't know all the science we know, but they know that the study lives or dies based on their cooperation. And that's an important thing. So whatever we do to nurture that, we also have newsletters and all of those things. And we have, as you pointed out, the lay summaries. So when a finding is published, when it's past peer review, and we're pretty confident of it, we write a summary of that in lay language. And a lot of the Tougaloo students actually have taken part in that whole process of understanding the material well enough that you can put it on a 6th grade level and put it out there. We all need things put on a 6th grade level, right? And particularly if science isn't your day-to-day occupation, you need that. That exercise, that effort, and the knowledge that we're doing that, I think, also has helped us maintain a positive relationship with the community. Thanks for the question. Yes?
Great talk, first of all. Very interesting. Thank you. My question is about the resilience factors that you mentioned that are extremely important, of course, in this matrix of tensions and resilience. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you have any data as to, you presented the data that is related to the risk factors.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you have any data related to the actual resilience factors,
right.
How those people that did not develop heart diseases, mm-hmm. so on.
Right.
How those factors are manifested. Exactly.
Well, and that is the sort of call to action for us. I don't think we have enough of that data. I think an example of it is what Dr. Lukes has recently published, and maybe some of the others and the co-authors are in the audience who can speak to that. But there's just a dearth of that connection, a dearth of interest, I think, among those who are more risk-oriented. And I think we need to change that. One thing I will point to out of Framingham is the look at, again, risk factors and the accumulation of those risk factors in midlife. You probably know this data showing that if you make it to 50 and you have no risk factors, no cardiovascular risk factors, now who among us will be that? But if you do, that your chance of having a cardiovascular event is less than 5% through age 90. And they show similar curves adding one risk factor at a time. In fact, I could pull that slide up if you're interested. That type of work is informative, but I feel it doesn't go far enough. And I come here really with more questions than answers, and I'm open to all sorts of ideas and thoughts in what you found in your work. This is most advanced, it seems to me, in the psychological literature, behavioral literature. And what I want to see is these very same principles emphasized, not just in terms of mental health, but physical well-being as well. Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to ask a question about the politics of biomedical research funding.
Okay.
And the Framingham study is a good example of a longitudinal study that's just been incredibly rich in the sorts of outcomes that have had an impact, I would argue, on the health of
Absolutely.
the nation.
I agree.
And I would also argue that the Jackson Heart Study has begun to have that kind of impact and has the potential to have a much stronger impact. And I know, I mean, you referred to it, but I'm also aware that there's been a tremendous struggle to continue to fund this important longitudinal study. And I just wondered about your thoughts of that potential and what we might do to be helpful.
Okay. All right. There are mics around here. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that all of us were disappointed. All of us in the field were disappointed. I won't say all. Many were disappointed to see the sort of pullback in support for great iconic studies like Framingham, and it impacted Jackson Heart as well. And how did it impact us? Basically, there are no more exams scheduled in the Jackson Heart study. Okay? There's plenty of data already in the bank, and we've only scratched the surface of that. So there's plenty to do. But the lack of, or the de-emphasis on longitudinal follow-up on all these various phenotypic characteristics, I think is a loss. Now, I guess the counter to that is that it's terribly expensive. The basic scientists will tell you that they could do so much with that same money, right? So there's that tension. And we also, though, have new technologies at our disposal. And while it will not be possible, say, with a cell phone to do MRIs, to do some of the really deep phenotyping we were able to do in the Jackson Heart and Framingham study, we will have numbers. We can reach not just 5,000, but 50,000 or 100,000 or more. It will be considerably more superficial, but the opportunity to get large numbers and from that get statistical relationships that are important, that have important messages about health and disease, I think, and it's affordable. I think those things are important thrusts for the research enterprise going forward. So I'll stop my comments there. But yeah.
On that, we should stop. Do want to invite people who would like to continue the conversation with Dr. Taylor. We have a little lunch next door, and so feel free to stop by and grab something to eat and continue to talk.